The sound of dry twigs under Hank Morrison's boots seemed to echo louder that late afternoon. He walked slowly, as if carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders, with the rifle slung over his shoulder and his eyes fixed on the ground covered in yellowing leaves. The forest around his farm was his only faithful companion, a silent refuge where no one asked questions. Hank no longer had family, friends, or neighbors to talk to. Since burying his wife and losing his son in a car accident more than a decade ago, the 74-year-old American veteran had become a shadow in the Colorado countryside, a man who survived the war, but not his life. On this particular day, however, the silence was broken. A dull crack, wood banging, perhaps a muffled scream, pierced the stillness and reached his ears. Hank stopped. The sound was coming from the direction of the neighboring farm, a place he had avoided for years, for reasons he could not explain. But something about that afternoon made him veer off course and approach slowly, with the caution of someone who still harbors fighting instincts. He stopped behind a barbed wire fence among bushes. He watched. There, in the middle of the dirt yard, stood a girl. Small, thin, covered in dust and sweat, dragging a bucket that seemed to weigh more than she did. She must have been 12 years old at most. Every step she took was an effort, as if her legs were made of lead. She fell once. No one helped her. A man on the porch just shouted at her to get up. He shouted again, and again. Hank stood still. The rifle now hung forgotten at his side. His breathing changed. That sight triggered something he hadn't expected. That girl. She didn't cry. She didn't look around. She just obeyed. As if she was no longer a child, but a body trained to serve. Have you ever seen someone like that? A person so broken inside that even their eyes look dead. Hank's heart raced. An old memory came rushing back. The village on the Afghan border, the muffled screams in the tents, the small bodies hidden behind piles of food. Those days came back to him like a blow. He had tried to forget them for decades. But now, standing at that fence, the images were vivid. The pain was real. And something inside him screamed for justice. But no one knew what Hank carried inside his chest, what he had seen, and what he had lost. He wasn't just an old man with stubble and worn clothes. He was a soldier, a failed father, a man he had once sworn to protect, and failed to do so. Until now. For some reason he didn't understand, that girl stirred everything that was buried inside him. It wasn't just compassion. It was a mission he never accomplished. And maybe the last chance to try to redeem himself. What you're about to discover may surprise you. Because in that moment, silently, without saying a word, Hank made a decision. One that would forever change not only that child's destiny, but his own as well. And what happened in the following days. It was still far from anything he could have foreseen. He walked up the same hill for the 10th morning in a row, but something was different. The wind was still, the sky too gray, and the sound of the roosters on the neighboring farm seemed muffled, as if time itself had paused. Hank knelt slowly among the tall bushes, his eyes fixed on the house ahead. The girl was there again, her head down, dragging a wheelbarrow too heavy for someone her size. But this time, it wasn't the dirt on her face that got to him. It was the red stain running down her leg. The blood trickled down slowly, mixing with the dust and sweat, as she limped along without making a sound. No screams, no cries. As if feeling pain was a luxury she could no longer afford. Hank clenched his fist. His mouth was dry, his breath was short. It was as if someone had plunged a blade into his own chest. The forest around him seemed to have vanished. There was only her, and that wound. At dinner that night, Hank couldn't bring himself to lift his spoon to his mouth. The food grew cold as he stared into space. The walls of the house seemed to shrink around him, and for a moment he swore he could hear the voices of dead soldiers, shouting orders in languages he had forgotten. He closed his eyes, but he saw the scene from the village again, decades ago. The children hiding under tents, the small bodies mixed in with the rubble, the pleading looks he had been trained to ignore. Orders were orders. But the soul never forgets. That night, Hank walked around the house like a ghost. He opened the drawer where he kept his army badge, took out his old rusty canteen, and strapped it to his waist. He wasn't a soldier anymore, but maybe he still knew how to protect someone. At the stroke of midnight, he left through the back door. His steps were firm, but silent. The darkness was dense, but he knew the woods like he knew the smell of his own skin. There was no doubt in his movements. Only an inner voice repeating, "If I don't do it, no one will." The gate to the neighboring farm was locked with a thin chain. Hank cut through it as if he were on a mission. The house seemed to be asleep, but his heart was not. He went around the back, found the makeshift shack where the girl slept, padlocked. He knelt down, listened. The sound of her breathing was light, almost imperceptible. With a thin wire, he unlocked the padlock with the precision of someone who had done this dozens of times before. Not on farms, but in makeshift prisons on the other side of the world. When the door creaked, the girl flinched, her eyes wide in the dark. He thought it was the monster coming back. But then he saw Hank's face. It wasn't gentle, it was firm. A lined, hard face with eyes that said, "Trust me, just this once." She hesitated, but she stood up. With effort, she leaned on his shoulders. Hank carried her in his arms, as if he were carrying a piece of his own broken soul. With every step, he felt the weight of her. And his own. Not of her body, but of everything he had not been able to save before. Of everything he could still lose. They arrived at his house without anyone noticing. The gate closed behind them, and it was as if the whole world changed direction. But no one in that village imagined that. That night, a child had been freed. And a veteran, for the first time in years, had chosen to fight for something real. The next morning, Hank made a plate of eggs and bread. He left them on the table and left. When he came back, the eggs were cold, untouched. The little girl was sitting in the corner of the room, her face covered by her hair, her arms wrapped around her knees. Hank didn't say anything. He just pushed the plate a little closer. And he left again. In the days that followed, this ritual repeated itself. Heavy silences, wordless lunches, sleeping in separate rooms. The sound of wood creaking at night seemed too loud for someone coming from the trauma. Lily, that was her name, he found out without asking, walked barefoot through the house, avoiding any space where Hank was, as if she expected punishment at any moment. Hank tried to distract himself by repairing an old fence, but it was no use. Every blow of the hammer felt like an explosion. Every splinter of wood in his finger sent his mind back to the improvised first aid on the front lines. The girl coughed at night. She had nightmares. She screamed names. She begged in her sleep not to be taken back. One night, she left a crooked note on the table. "Thanks, I try not to get in the way." Hank read it for half an hour. The words trembled on the paper. Then he wrote back, in his military handwriting, "You're safe. No one orders you around here." But no one knew how much Hank doubted his own promise. Because peace had never lasted long enough in his life. And now, as he sheltered someone so fragile, he felt the fear return. Fear of failing. Fear of losing her too. Still, little by little, small changes began to emerge. One day, Lily put sugar in his tea. The next, she cleaned the porch. Then one afternoon, as he was pruning the old peach tree in the backyard, she came over. Shyly. Without speaking. She just held out a book. It was about wild horses. Hank didn't know what to say. He just took the book. And nodded. That was the first step. But it was also the beginning of something new. Because when the past comes back, it doesn't give you any warning. And certain pains, when they heal, create scars that no one can erase. Hank's house seemed smaller this morning. Smaller, colder, and infinitely quieter. He pushed open the door slowly, Lily in his arms, and stepped onto the floor as if he were entering a broken sanctuary. The girl, huddled against his chest, was shivering. Not from the cold, but from something deeper. something that seemed to come from a place where hope had long since died. He laid her down on the old couch, took a worn blanket from the dresser, and covered her feet. There were no words. She asked for nothing. And he, who had lived through ambushes, trenches, and lonely burials, had never felt so lost as he did in that moment. In that house, full of dusty portraits and furniture that no one touched anymore, there now lived a secret. Lily fell asleep sitting up, with her eyes half open, as if she had learned that closing her eyes was dangerous. Hank sat there on the living room floor, watching the clock on the wall tick, the same clock that had stopped the day his son died. He couldn't explain why, but he didn't want to wind it up again. The next morning before sunrise, he lit the wood stove. The smell of coffee mingled with the wood smoke, and the sound of the kettle was the only living sound of the morning. Lily was still standing there, her face turned to the window, unblinking, as if she were waiting for someone to come and get her. Hank set a mug in front of her. She didn't move a muscle. Then he got up, went outside, and went to mend the chicken coop fence, just to keep his hands busy, because his mind was already too busy. In the days that followed, time passed slowly, like an old man walking against the wind. Lily didn't speak. Hank didn't push it either. Their routine was a silent choreography. He left food on the table. She picked it up when he left. He washed her clothes in silence. She put away his shoes by the door. But there was tension in everything. Every noise outside made Lily cower. A simple creak of the chair made her shoulders shiver. Hank watched it all with a lump in his throat, because he knew that language, the silence of trauma. One afternoon, while sweeping the porch, she found small scratch marks on the wooden railing, and it dawned on her. Lily was marking the days, just like the prisoners of war did. He then took a piece of paper, wrote, "You are safe here," folded it, and placed it under her cup. The next day, the reply came back. For how long? It was like a shot to the chest. He spent the rest of the day cleaning out the barn, rearranging tools he no longer used. But it was just an excuse to avoid that question. Because the truth is, he didn't know the answer either. But no one saw what Hank carried inside his soul. The war for him had never ended. It had just changed scenery. The nights were the worst. Lily would wake up sweating, her eyes wide and her fists clenched. One night, she screamed so loudly that Hank came running into the room, tripping over the furniture. She was huddled in the corner of the bed, begging not to be taken back. The look on her face when she saw him there was one of terror. And that was the most painful part. She didn't recognize him. Hank knelt down. He put down his rifle, showed his empty hands, and said simply, "You're home now." She didn't answer. But that morning she left the bedroom door ajar. And that, for him, was like a hug. Time began to establish new routines. One day, Lily followed him to the chicken coop. She sat in silence, just watching him feed the birds. Another day, she helped him plant tomatoes in the flower bed, still without speaking. But her presence was already an answer. But there was a shadow hanging over them both. On Friday of that week, a dark car drove too slowly down the dirt road. Hank saw it in the reflection in the window. The car drove away. But it came back on Saturday. And on Sunday. At different times. On Monday, Hank was on the porch when he saw a figure stop on the other side of the fence. The man didn't say anything. He just watched. Then he turned around and got into his car. Lily was in the kitchen, but she froze when she heard the engine. The glass fell from her hand and shattered on the floor. The terror in her eyes said it all. She knew who she was. And Hank understood. They were looking for her. So he did what he did best. He prepared. He took the old radio out of the closet, checked the ammunition in his old rifle. Not because he planned to use it, but because he knew that those who are prepared need not threaten. He reinforced the locks, analyzed routes, and set discreet traps in vulnerable spots on the property. And, most importantly, he did something he hadn't done for years. He went to the city. At the police station, he asked to speak to the sheriff. He explained little. He showed photos. He reported everything he saw on that farm. But he didn't give names. He just wanted to record it, leave a trace. Because if something happened to him, someone would have somewhere to start. When he returned, Lily was standing on the porch with a piece of paper in her hands. It was a drawing. She had drawn the two of them, herself and Hank sitting side by side with the sun behind them. He looked at it as if he were watching a child being born. And he said in a hoarse voice, "We're going to be fine." But there was one detail he didn't notice at that moment, one that would make all the difference in the following days. And that's exactly what I need to tell you about now. Comment here. No one sees what the soul carries. I want to know if this story is touching you too. The clock read 3:17 a.m. when Hank woke with a snap. It wasn't a dream. It wasn't a memory. It was a real noise, a door creaking, or maybe a window that wasn't properly closed. He grabbed his flashlight, slid his feet across the cold floorboards, and walked slowly down the dark hallway. As he approached the kitchen, he saw the light on, dim, almost timid. Lily was standing there with a blanket wrapped around her back, a mug of milk shaking in her hands. Her eyes met his, as if they'd been caught doing something forbidden. But Hank didn't say a word. He just walked over, slowly pulled out a chair, and sat down, letting the silence speak for him. Lily, hesitantly, sat down too. It was the first time they shared that space as two living people, and not as two survivors. She didn't say anything, but her eyes were different. Still hurt, but less empty. The kettle whistled on the stove, and Hank got up to turn it off. In that small gesture, something inside him broke. Not with pain, but with recognition. It was as if this girl was, without realizing it, rekindling a part of him that had been extinguished for too long. The next morning, he found a pair of small, dirty shoes by the door. And next to them was a new note, written more firmly. "I want to help." Hank held that paper for long minutes. He read and reread it, and for the first time, he smiled. It wasn't a wide smile, nor an easy one, but it was sincere. Even so, the atmosphere remained dense, charged with a tension that only those who have been through a lot understand. The two walked around the house as if they were stepping on invisible shards. Any sudden movement still scared Lily, and any silence that lasted too long made Hank dive back into his own abyss. He tried to protect her, but there were things that even he didn't know how to face. That week, she had a crisis, the worst since she arrived. She woke up in the middle of the night, screaming names that Hank didn't recognize. She called out for a woman. Then she begged not to be left in the dark room. Hank ran to her room, but hesitated at the door. Seeing that girl trembling, with her hands over her face, begging for help from someone who was no longer there, it was like reliving all the pleas he couldn't answer in the field. He came in, sat on the floor, and just said, "I'm here." And he stayed there, for hours. Until the crying stopped, until the fear subsided. But no one knew what Hank was really up against in the shadows, because this wasn't just his home. It was also the field where he waged war against his own ghosts. All the faces he couldn't save, all the failed missions, all the screams that never stopped in his head. And now there was another detail that began to bother him. The black car from last week. It came back, and came back again, always slowing down in front of the property. It never parked, but it never drove by casually either. And Hank knew it. This was reconnaissance. People who study their surroundings before they act. He began to sleep less, to walk with his rifle closer, to revisit escape routes he hadn't used since his active duty. While Lily slept in her room, he kept watch from the porch, a sentinel of memories and promises. But what hurt most was not being able to tell her that everything was okay, because he didn't believe it himself. One cloudy afternoon, as they were repairing the roof of the chicken coop together, Lily stopped, looked at him, and asked for the first time, "Have you ever been afraid?" Hank turned slowly, wiped the sweat from his forehead, and replied with raw sincerity, "Every single day." She nodded silently, but she didn't go back to work. Instead, she walked to the porch and stood there, watching the front gate. She was quieter than usual, and that worried Hank. Hours later, he found a drawing in her room. It was simple, drawn in pencil. It showed two figures sitting side by side, and in the background, the black car. At the top of the page, she had written, "He knows where I am." That night was different. Hank realized that the time he thought he had, to protect, to care, to prepare, was running out. These men were closer than he cared to admit, and maybe they wouldn't accept peace for an answer. He made a decision. He went to the local police station and spoke to the sheriff again. This time, he spared no names. He gave details, the times, the license plates, and, most importantly, what he had seen on the farm days before the rescue. He brought with him an old digital camera, where he had saved some photos taken from a distance, with the zoom setting at its maximum, that showed Lily being forced to carry heavy objects under strict supervision. The sheriff listened to him in silence. Then he closed the notebook and said, "If it is true, this is serious, but we must proceed with caution." Hank nodded, but he knew the world outside of uniforms moved more slowly than the world of survival. So when he got home, he put together a security plan. He hid documents. He diverted the power from the old shed. He hid Lily for 2 days in a strategic spot on the property, where even he would have trouble finding her if he didn't know the way. But no one imagined that. That same weekend, an unexpected visit would change everything. And the way she arrived. It made Hank understand that the past is never completely buried. Comment here. I felt the weight of it. Tell me if, like Hank, you have also had to face the most difficult war of all, the one that happens inside us. The sky was dull that morning, as if time itself was holding its breath. Hank silently watered the plants, feigning normality, but his eyes were far away. He pretended not to hear the engine of the car approaching on the dirt road, but he felt every vibration of the ground, as if he were back in the desert, with the radio whispering codes and adrenaline blocking his thoughts. The black car slowed down once more in front of the property. It didn't stop, but it didn't go straight either. It just stood there, slow, menacing, like a sentence that had not yet been pronounced. Lily watched from the crack in the window. Her face was pale, her lips were bitten, her shoulders hunched as if she were going to disappear into herself. She knew the pattern. First they look, then they hit, and then they take. It had been that way before. It could be that way again. But Hank didn't let fear take hold. That night he lit the porch lamp and with his weather-beaten hands wrote a letter. It wasn't to the police. It wasn't to Lily. It was to himself. It was the kind of letter men write when they know there may be no tomorrow. On the envelope he scrawled, "If I fall, you continue." He hid the letter behind the frame of an old photo, the only one he had left of his wife. But no one out there knew what that lonely old man was building, a silent resistance camp. The next morning, Lily handed him a small piece of paper. Just 2 words. "Teach me." Hank frowned. "Teach what?" he asked, and she answered, "How to protect someone." Hank felt something inside his chest crack and straighten at the same time, as if life had just returned meaning to a weary heart. He was no longer just the guardian of a house. Now he was the instructor of someone who needed courage to live. He started slowly, showing how to identify distant sounds, how to know if someone had passed through a fence, how to use the wind to your advantage. But the most important thing was not in the military tricks. It was in the conversations. He taught how to breathe when fear gripped you, to recognize that feeling pain was not a weakness, that crying sometimes was a survival tactic. Meanwhile, the car visits increased, once, twice a day. Then tire tracks began to appear around the property, footprints near the fence. A rag left near the gate with a strong smell of burning oil. It was a taunt, a message. "We are here, and we know where you are." Lily started sleeping with the door locked, but no longer under the bed. And that, for Hank, was already a victory. Then, one afternoon when the sky held the promise of a storm, the truth came knocking, literally. a stern-looking woman with a clipboard and a badge pinned to her chest. "Social services. We've received an anonymous tip." Hank remained calm. He asked her to come in. The woman took in everything: the clean dishes, Lily's sketchbooks, the stocked closets, the made bed. She asked why Lily wasn't in school, why she wasn't talking much, why there were no custody records. Hank responded calmly but firmly. He told her that the girl was under informal protection, in the process of reporting, that he had turned over evidence to the police station and was awaiting guidance from the authorities, that she was safer there than anywhere else. The woman looked at him skeptically, but took note. He said he would be back soon with a report. Lily, who had been watching from afar, had a relapse that night. She threw up twice. She cried silently. She tore up her drawing and locked herself in her room. Hank stood outside for hours, sitting, waiting, not knocking, not pushing. It wasn't until the next day that she came out, and she said, "They're going to take me again, aren't they?" Hank crouched down, looked her in the eye and said, "Not if you trust me." And she responded with something he didn't expect. "I already do. I'm just afraid of losing you." This time, he was the one who walked away to cry. But not in front of her. Outside, behind the barn, where he kept his tools, and the memories he could never bury. But there was a piece missing from this board. That same afternoon, a rusty pickup truck drove up. It was the sheriff. He got out slowly, hat in hand, face serious. He called Hank by his full name, something he hadn't done since he was on the job. Then he said, "We need to talk. Her story. It's not just what it seems. We discovered something in the system." And what he said in the following minutes? It would change everything. Comment here. Fear also teaches. I want to know, what would you do if someone you loved was about to be taken away again, and you knew you had little time to act? The sun was rising slowly behind the mountains, tinting the sky with timid shades of orange and gray, when Hank leaned his head against the living room window. Outside, dust still hung in the air, suspended in the wake of the police cars that had taken away the men who once thought they could do whatever they wanted with a child. Inside the house, Lily sat on the floor, her knees drawn up to her chest, hugging her legs. She wasn't crying anymore, but her face still looked stuck somewhere between fear and amazement. The silence between them was different now. It was no longer the silence of distrust. It was the silence of those who had survived together. Hank approached slowly, without rushing, and sat down on the floor next to her. He said nothing. He simply took a crumpled sheet of paper from his pocket. It was her drawing, the same one that had been torn up days before, but which he had taped together and put in his jacket pocket. He handed it to her without saying a word. Lily took the paper carefully, her eyes slowly filling with tears, as if she were facing a truth that was still forming inside her. She looked at Hank and, in an almost imperceptible gesture, leaned her shoulder against his. He closed his eyes for a second. He took a deep breath. There, in that exact moment, something inside them both realigned. But what no one knew, not even Lily, was that this victory had not been theirs alone. The day before, while the sheriff was organizing the raid, Hank received a call. It was from the military base at Fort Carson. An old contact had seen the report he had given to the local sheriff and recognized the name of one of the attackers. James Heller, a former civilian contractor for the armed forces, wanted on suspicion of abuse in conflict zones. Hank did not respond immediately. He simply thanked her and hung up, his hand shaking. And that's when it all fell into place. These men weren't just hiding a girl. They were covering up a dirty past. And Hank, without even knowing it, had placed himself in the middle of a crossroads that went far beyond the farm fences. But none of that mattered now. The danger had receded. And for the first time, Lily could walk to the kitchen without looking over her shoulder. She made herself some tea, just the way Hank liked it, and poured it with her hands still shaking. He smiled, a brief, almost secret smile, but one she caught. And that was enough. The next day, Hank put on an apron, something he had never done before, and the two of them made pancakes together. The kitchen was a battlefield of flour and suppressed laughter. And when Lily accidentally cracked an egg on the floor and recoiled as if expecting a scream, Hank just laughed and deliberately threw another one on the floor, causing them both to double over in laughter. It was simple. It was small. But it was everything. Later that week, the sheriff returned to the house. He had good news. With the history of abuse confirmed and Hank's cooperation, the foster care process would be expedited. But he didn't come alone. Beside him, a young social worker, named Emily, asked to speak with Lily. The conversation was long. She asked about Lily's feelings, if she had nightmares, if she remembered any happy places. And Lily, for the first time, spoke without fear. She said, "Here, with Hank. This is my happy place." Emily left with wet eyes, promising she would be back soon. But before getting into the car, she turned to Hank and said, "You didn't just save a child. You saved a story." But no one knew that Hank had kept one last letter, one he had written to himself on the day of the rescue, before the police arrived. He had kept it hidden, not daring to read it, until now. Sitting on the porch next to Lily, with a blanket on his knees and the sound of the wind cutting through the open field, he opened the envelope with slow hands. The letter said, "If you're reading this, it's because you didn't run away. It's because you decided to stay. And if you stayed, it's because you understood that the war was never against the outside world. It was against the fear of loving again. Congratulations, soldier. You won." He couldn't hold back his tears. But this time, they weren't tears of pain. Lily noticed and just rested her head on his arm, as if she understood everything without needing to ask anything. And so, on that cold night in Colorado, two souls who were on the brink of death discovered that true courage lies not in fighting, but in continuing, even after everything. Comment here. Being strong is when we choose to stay. I want to know what you felt when you saw that. Sometimes a hug can be more powerful than any weapon. The yellow light of late afternoon filtered through the cracks in the porch as Hank spread a blanket over Lily's lap. She had just come home from school, her hair tied up in a mess and a worn book in her hands. The wind blew lightly, carrying the smell of wet wood and fertile earth, the same smell he had smelled years ago, when he and his son had gone camping on weekends that never came back. But now, there was something different in the air. There was life. She opened the book and began to read quietly, not with the fluidity of someone who had always studied, but with the strength of someone who had fought hard to get there. Hank didn't correct each stumbled word. He just listened, present, connected. It was as if each syllable reconstructed pieces of a world they were creating together, from scratch. But not everything was simple. The marks of the past, although silenced, still breathed within them. Some nights, Lily would still wake up scared. She would leave the room silently, sit on the edge of his bed, and stay there until the sun began to rise. Hank didn't ask questions. He would just get up, put the kettle on, and prepare 2 teas, one with sugar, the way she preferred it. It was their language. Caring without demanding. Being together without invading. Hank had his moments too. Sometimes he would disappear into the old shed out back. He would spend hours looking at old maps, rusty tools, letters from the war that he had never had the heart to throw away. Lily knew. She knew that there were pains that could not be explained, only respected. It was on one of those weekends that something unexpected happened. A new boy from school started visiting Lily. His name was Caleb. He was shy, kind, didn't talk much, and was a very good drawer. Lily was excited every time he came over. But Hank watched from a distance. Every gesture, every laugh, every silence. Until one day, he saw Lily laughing out loud. Really laughing, without fear, without looking over her shoulder. And it broke him inside. Because it had been so long since he had heard that sound from her, that joy seemed too foreign to be trusted. He had to sit down, take a deep breath, and remind himself She no longer needs to survive. Now she can live. But no one knew what Hank was going through inside with each small victory. Because loving after so much trauma is like learning to walk with injured legs. It requires courage, balance, and above all, a willingness to fall again. Still, the days went by. The school recognized Lily's progress. They offered psychological counseling and tutoring. She began writing essays with titles like My Safe Place, The Man Who Didn't Shout at Me, My New Home Has a Big Sky. Hank read each one of them in secret, at the end of the day, with tears in his eyes and his soul rebuilding. And it was one of those mornings, when Lily was already leaving for school with the new backpack that her neighbors had helped her buy, that a different envelope arrived in the mail. It was thick, official, with coats of arms and gold seals. Hank held the envelope with trembling hands. It took him a while to open it, because, deep down, he knew what it was. Inside, a document with few words and a red stamp at the top. Adoption confirmed. He stared at the paper for several long minutes. Then he walked to her room, hung the document on the wall, and wrote below it with a thick pen. Now we are family by choice. Lily saw the message when she got home from school and didn't say anything. She just hugged him, without warning, with a strength he had never felt before. They stood there, in the center of the house, where once there had been only silence. Now there was love. And there was no need to say anything else. Because there, between the creaks of the old wood and the soft light coming in through the window, lived the certainty that, even without applause, without cameras, without an audience, one of the greatest battles in life had been won. Comment here. Scars tell stories too. I want to know, what has touched you the most so far? What part of this journey spoke directly to your heart? If you've stuck around this far, it's because something in this story spoke to you on some level. Maybe Hank's courage, maybe Lily's silence, or maybe the simple fact of seeing that, even after everything, it's still possible to rebuild what seemed lost. If this type of narrative touches you, if you value stories that go beyond the surface and capture what we truly feel, then subscribe to the channel. There's a lot of stuff like this coming up. And honestly, I think you'll want to be around. Oh, and if this journey reached you in any way, comment below. I walked with them until the end. I want to know who walked with us this far. If you want to strengthen this connection, leave your like as well. This will help this content reach more people who may need to hear exactly this. And it doesn't stop there. No. There's a video here that continues with the same vibe. Click and come with me, because the next story might surprise you even more.